Who would have thought that yesterday's headlines could feed today's hope? On a windy evening outside a closed library, a young woman in a threadbare coat sat beneath a street lamp, smoothing out wrinkled newspaper pages she'd pulled from a recycling bin. She didn't beg, didn't complain. She just read, lips moving silently like someone trying to keep her mind warm when the body was cold. A black ink smudge crossed her cheek like war paint. Across the street, a man in a dark overcoat paused. He had more subscriptions than free hours, more meetings than quiet moments. But something about the way she underlined sentences with a broken pencil made him cross the road. He offered food. She asked for 5 minutes to finish an article. He laughed, and then stopped laughing when she began to dismantle an op-ed with the precision of a professor. In that instant, the Millionaire CEO realized he'd just met the smartest person his company hadn't hired. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. A cold wind curled around the corner of the city library, rattling the chained doors and scattering torn flyers across the pavement. Beneath the yellow glow of a flickering street lamp sat a young woman in a worn coat, her knees drawn up, an open newspaper stretched carefully across them as if it were something precious. The pages were creased, edges frayed, the ink slightly blurred from dampness, but her eyes followed every line with quiet intensity. Her lips moved soundlessly, tracing the words as if she could warm herself with their rhythm. A smudge of ink streaked across her cheek where she had brushed away her hair. To anyone passing by, she looked like just another shadow on the sidewalk, one more forgotten figure among many. But if you stopped long enough, if you looked closely, you would see how her broken pencil underlined sentences with precise, deliberate strokes. She wasn't killing time. She was absorbing it, dissecting it, refusing to let her mind starve the way her stomach did. Across the street, traffic rolled past, headlights washing over a man who had just stepped out of a black car. He adjusted the dark wool overcoat on his shoulders, checked his phone, then froze. Something, he couldn't have said what, pulled his gaze toward the figure beneath the lamp. He watched her tilt her head, frown, and scribble in the margin of a discarded editorial as if she were grading it. Curiosity pushed him forward. Declan Reed had seen thousands of faces, thousands of hungry hands reaching for him in business meetings, networking events, conferences. But this woman didn't reach. She didn't even notice him until his shadow fell across the page. She looked up slowly, and for the first time in years, Declan found himself at a loss for words. Her eyes, wide and sharp at once, reflected the light of the lamp and something else. Something unbroken. "You'll ruin your eyes like that," he said finally, nodding toward the faded print. "It's freezing out here. Let me buy you dinner." Her gaze held steady. "Dinner lasts a few hours," she replied, her voice soft but unyielding. "This lasts longer." She tapped the paper with her pencil. "But if you're offering a table and a kettle of hot water, I'll take that instead." He blinked, surprised, then chuckled. It slipped out louder than he meant, but her face remained composed, almost serious. She returned her attention to the page, as if dismissing him. "I wasn't joking," she added, almost as an afterthought. "A place that doesn't throw you out for reading, that's rarer than food." Something in her words disarmed him. He thought of the pristine lounges on the top floor of his headquarters, empty shelves stocked with books for decoration, polished tables that no one dared to use. He thought of the stacks of unread reports piling on his desk, of the noise of meetings where no one really listened. And then he looked back at her, sitting in the cold, underlining ideas in a newspaper rescued from a trash bin. "I have a place like that," he heard himself say. 31st floor, decent coffee, a better newspaper collection than this one. Her brows lifted, skeptical. She carefully folded the pages, aligning the edges with a precision that suggested a kind of reverence. She slipped the pencil behind her ear, hugged the paper against her chest, then rose with quiet dignity. "I'll come," she said. "If I can take these with me. They're mine now." "They're already yours," Declan answered. "I'm Declan." She gave a small, lopsided smile. "Ella Vames, independent researcher of waste bins and public discourse." The elevator mirrored them both as it climbed. Declan stood tall, shoulders square, his reflection neat, controlled. Ella stood at an angle, her coat too thin, hair pulled back in a loose knot, clutching her newspapers like sacred texts. She avoided the mirror, choosing instead to watch the floor numbers rise. For once, Declan didn't pull out his phone. He studied her instead, the way she seemed both fragile and unshakable at the same time. The 31st floor opened to silence. Glass walls revealed the city glittering below. Plants lined the corners, their leaves glossy in the low light. To the right stretched a room labeled Archives. To the left, a small kitchen island, the hum of a coffee machine still warm from earlier use. Declan gestured toward a table near the window. "Sit," he said, setting down a tray with a teapot and a plate of banana bread someone had left from a staff meeting. Steam curled upward, carrying the scent of cinnamon. Ella placed her newspapers carefully on the table, smoothing them again. She poured hot water into the chipped cup he handed her, wrapped her fingers around it as if it were the first warmth she'd held all day. "You really read these instead of buying food?" he asked, unable to stop himself. She sipped, then looked at him over the rim of the cup. "Food keeps you alive for hours. Words keep you alive for years. Sometimes, they keep you from making mistakes that cost more than hunger." Declan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Interest, genuine and uncalculated. He leaned forward. "So you're a journalist? A student?" Ella shook her head. "Neither. I'm a reader. Cheapest profession in the world. And the freest, if you know where to look." She tilted her head. "But tell me honestly, why did you bring me up here? Pity? Curiosity? Or did you just want to polish your conscience?" He almost laughed, but her eyes told him she wanted the truth. He exhaled, ran a hand through his hair, and admitted, "I brought you up because you were underlining thin air, and because—" He paused, the words coming slowly. "I was ashamed. I spend my days surrounded by people who pretend to understand, and you were out there, correcting an editorial with a broken pencil." For the first time, Ella's lips curved into something close to a real smile. She tore off a piece of banana bread, broke it neatly in half, and set one half in front of him. "Then we'll start with this," she said simply. "Equal shares. No charity, no pity. Just two readers dissecting today's nonsense." Declan stared at the small piece of bread, then at her. It wasn't much, but somehow it felt like the beginning of something more sustaining than $1,000 dinner. And for the first time in years, the man who owned everything sat down at his own table and realized he had been starving. The city woke beneath a pale sky, but on the 31st floor of Reed Enterprises, the world already buzzed. Screens glowed with charts, analysts murmured over projections, and assistants hurried from desk to desk carrying folders like shields. Declan usually entered these rooms with a mask of control, prepared to face a day of endless voices trying to convince him of things he already knew. This morning was different. He walked in quietly, hands in his pockets, and beside him trailed Ella, still in the same coat, clutching her newspapers, her hair caught up in a loose knot that refused to look polished no matter how many times she adjusted it. She looked as if she had wandered into the wrong building, but her gaze was steady, unflinching, sweeping over the space with calm curiosity. A few heads turned, then quickly looked away. Whispers hummed like static. Declan ignored them. He led Ella into the glass-walled conference room where his strategy team was already waiting. "We're reviewing the adoption curve for the new platform," said one of the managers, clearing his throat as if the unexpected presence unsettled him. "The numbers suggest strong engagement in the first week." But Ella slid into a chair at the corner of the table without waiting to be asked. She spread out one of her newspapers, the edges soft from use, and began scanning an article. Declan caught the twitch of irritation on the manager's face. He almost intervened, but then Ella spoke. "Your model is wrong," she said quietly, eyes still on the page. The room froze. A dozen pairs of eyes turned toward her. "Excuse me?" The manager bristled. She finally looked up, pencil poised between her fingers. "You're projecting engagement as if users behave like trained customers. But if you'd bothered to read this," she tapped the headline in front of her, "you'd see consumer behavior is fragmenting. People no longer commit to platforms, they flirt with them. They'll love your app for 7 days, then ghost you like a bad date." A few muffled laughs scattered around the table. Declan watched, fascinated, as Ella leaned forward. "You want them to stay?" she continued. "Then stop chasing loyalty. Build routines. Small, repeatable habits they don't even notice until it's part of their morning. That's what makes people come back. Not fireworks on day one. Silence. The kind that prickles on skin." One of the analysts, younger than the rest, adjusted his glasses. "That's actually what our secondary report suggested. But it didn't make the deck because we thought the CEO wanted optimism." Declan felt the corner of his mouth twitch. He leaned back, folding his arms, and let Ella continue. "You're selling permanence in a world addicted to novelty," she said. "It's like promising a marriage on the first swipe. People don't believe in forever anymore. They believe in tomorrow morning. Give them something worth waking up to." Her words landed with the weight of clarity, simple but undeniable. The same clarity Declan had seen in her the night before, scribbling notes under a street lamp while the world passed her by. The room shifted. Whispered side conversations died. Even the most skeptical manager cleared his throat and said, "Perhaps we should revisit our retention strategy." Ella shrugged, as if none of this mattered to her. She returned to her newspaper, circling a statistic with slow precision. To her, it was just another conversation, another idea to wrestle with. But to Declan, it was something far greater. It was the proof that his instinct had been right. This woman, plucked from the cold with nothing but ink-stained fingers and a stubborn mind, had just out-argued his million-dollar consultants without breaking a sweat. After the meeting, as the team dispersed in uneasy silence, Declan lingered. Ella stacked her papers, careful not to tear the fragile sheets. "You realize," he said, "you just embarrassed my entire staff." Ella lifted a brow. "I didn't embarrass them. The truth did. If they can't stand it, they shouldn't publish it." Declan laughed softly. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him like that. Not filtered, not rehearsed, just brutally honest. "Stay," he said impulsively. "Help me see things the way you do." Ella shook her head. "I'm not an employee. I'm just passing through. Besides, people don't like when outsiders hold up mirrors. They'll hate me by morning." "Then let them," Declan replied. "Mirrors are the only way we know if we're still real." For the first time, she faltered. A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Hesitation, maybe even longing. But she closed her papers and stood. "I'll stay until I finish today's issue," she said. "After that, you're on your own." Declan smiled. It wasn't much of a promise, but he knew enough to recognize the beginning of one. Morning broke like a rumor, thin, fast, impossible to catch once it slipped from one mouth to another. On the street below Reed Enterprises, a freelance photographer snapped a picture without meaning to make news. A woman in a threadbare coat stepping through the glossy revolving doors beside Declan Reed. Their reflections warped together in the glass like two different worlds trying to agree on a shape. By the time the building's elevators sighed awake, the photo had already split into a dozen captions online, then 100. The words didn't ask. They decided. Declan didn't notice right away. He had coffee, he had calendars, he had 3 meetings back-to-back that he was determined to shorten with one-line verdicts. Ella found a corner table near the window and unfolded a new stack of newspapers with the reverence of someone unwrapping a gift. The city glowed below her, hard and bright. She ignored the view. She had learned long ago that beautiful things could make hunger feel like mockery. The first hint came as an assistant hovered at the doorway with a strange smile that wasn't quite a smile. "You might want to see this," she said, holding out her phone to Declan like a peace offering. He glanced down. There they were, grainy and intimate despite the distance. His hand on the glass to steady the revolving door. Ella half-turned toward him, her coat too thin for the wind, the newspapers pressed to her chest like a shield. The caption read, "Billionaire CEO and mystery woman. Who is she?" Another headline suggested, "New muse or new publicity stunt." Declan felt heat rise under his collar. Not embarrassment, not exactly, but an old, sour anger at how easily strangers built scaffolds of certainty on top of nothing. He handed the phone back with steady fingers. "They'll have something else to gasp about by lunch," he said. It sounded braver than he felt. An hour later, the guesses had multiplied, evolved teeth. Charity case turned executive pet. Social experiment. Midlife crisis with ink stains. One account compiled a slideshow. Zoomed in stills of Ella's coat, the stains on her sleeve, the bent pencil tucked behind her ear. Each image annotated like a crime scene. Another dug up a city registry of shelter locations and circled them like she was a scavenger hunt. The internet was not a room. There was no door to close, no window to latch. It was a weather system. By mid-morning, security pinged Declan. A reporter downstairs requesting comment. Then another. A third, louder outlet sent a polite email that sounded like a threat wearing perfume. His head of communications appeared in the doorway with a tablet hugged tight against her blazer. "We can ride it out," she said. "Or we can give them a frame before they build an uglier one." Behind her, a second shadow fell across the carpet, stiletto heels announcing themselves before the voice did. "I brought my own frame," said the shadow, stepping into light. Vivian Hart looked like a magazine spread that had become sentient and impatient. Smooth hair, precise makeup, a silk coat the color of new champagne. Once upon a time she and Declan had learned one another's strengths and weaknesses by heart, and then weaponized the list through a breakup that should have been quiet and wasn't. "Declan," she said now with the practiced warmth of someone who understood cameras better than weather. "Tell me you didn't just adopt a storyline." He didn't move. "Good morning to you too. Is this a phase?" Vivian asked, eyes flicking past him to where Ella sat, half hidden by columns of newsprint. "Or are you auditioning for sainthood? Because you've never been good with costumes." "It's not a costume," Declan said evenly. "It's a person." Vivian's smile went fine and sharp. "A person is exactly what your investors will ask about at 11. They're already messaging me. Don't look so shocked. I still sit on 2 advisory boards that happen to love your stock when you look boring." She turned, addressing Ella across the room as if issuing a toast. "Hello, I'm Vivian. This is a workplace. People here have jobs. What do you have?" Ella looked up slowly, pencil poised. Yesterday's paper, she said. And a question. Is there a reason you're speaking to me like a headline? Her voice remained calm. She didn't stand. She didn't apologize for occupying a chair she hadn't been specifically granted. Vivian blinked, recalibrated. It's charming that you read. It's less charming that you're being used. By whom? Ella asked. Vivian tilted her head toward Declan. By the oldest narrative in the book. Boy rescues girl. World claps. It's a classic because it always works, until it doesn't. She turned back to Declan. You're smarter than this. Even when we disagreed, you didn't need pity props. Something inside Ella cooled, like metal plunged into water. She closed the newspaper carefully, as if gentleness now mattered more than it ever had. I'm not a prop, she said, and no one rescued me. He offered me a table and I took it. That's called consent, not charity. Vivian's brows rose a fraction. Consent also includes the right not to be photographed walking into a building you don't belong in. Everyone belongs somewhere, Ella said, standing at last. Today I belong at a table where the tea is hot and the reading is quiet. I'll leave when the tea cools or the noise gets louder than the words. She looked at Declan then, and the tiny nod he gave her was almost nothing, a thread you might miss unless you were watching for it. The head of communications cleared her throat, mercifully pulling the air back into the room. We should prep for investors, she said to Declan, eyes apologizing before her mouth could. They've asked for context. Context. Such a gentle, reasonable word for panic. Declan glanced at the clock, then at Ella. Come, he said, softer now. If you're willing, you don't have to speak. Just be there. I'm not a talisman, Ella replied, but she picked up her papers anyway. The boardroom felt colder than the lobby, colder than the sidewalk even. Frosted glass muted the city's bright hunger to a diffused ache. Around the table, suits arranged themselves in tidy severity. On a screen at the far end of the room, two faces joined via video, both wearing the expression of men who preferred spreadsheets to surprises. Declan, began Alistair Green, a longtime investor whose voice had the texture of sanded oak. We're fielding inquiries. Your guest has become a trending topic. Markets don't like stories they didn't write. He nodded toward Ella without truly seeing her. We need the message to be discipline and focus. What's undisciplined about listening? Ella asked, not unkindly. She remained standing at the back of the room, one hand resting on a chair as if ready to leave. I listened to your product pitch yesterday. It sounded beautiful and tired at the same time, like you were trying to convince yourselves you still believed. Alistair's mouth tightened. And you are. Someone who reads because I can't afford to be wrong, she said. Newspapers taught me more about survival than charity pamphlets ever did. So when I say your users will flirt with your app and leave by day 7, I'm not guessing. I'm watching. People like me don't have room to be loyal to anything that doesn't feed them a habit. A ripple moved around the table. Annoyance, curiosity, irritation at being startled. Declan let it move. He had learned that silences, like storms, revealed where buildings leaked. Another investor, younger and keener, leaned forward. This is all very poetic, but what we're asking, Ms. Vames. Ella Vames. Ms. Vames, what we're asking is whether your presence here is part of a coherent strategy, or whether our CEO has decided to improvise. Both, Ella said, before Declan could answer. He invited me up because he's human. He asked me to stay because I told him the truth that made his team angry. She paused, then added, if you want coherence, build a company that can withstand a hard mirror. Vivian's voice, honeyed steel, slipped through the half-open door from where she'd remained in the hallway. Investors don't buy mirrors. They buy futures. Futures crack when the present is fake, Ella replied without turning. What you buy depends on what you're willing to look at. Declan felt, absurdly, like laughing and like breaking something at once. He looked down the table, past the graphs and forecasts and the tidy little lies they told themselves to keep moving, and said, "Here is the frame. I met someone who sees the ground we're walking on. I'm asking her to tell us when it's ice. If that is incoherent to anyone here, we should reconsider whether we're building anything that deserves to stand." He wasn't sure until he heard it that he had meant to say we. The word settled in the room with a weight that surprised him. Ella's eyes flicked toward him. Something unspoken tugged between them, a rope tossed across a fast river. The meeting ended not with applause and not with revolt, but with the uneasy clatter of chairs that meant no one had won and no one had yet lost. Outside, the weather system of the internet continued its spin, scatterings of contempt and curiosity pelting the windows in alternating bursts. The head of communications promised a statement by afternoon. Vivian left a business card on the table, even though she knew they already had her number. The investors disappeared back into their screens. Ella walked to the window and rested her forehead briefly against the cool glass. Her breath fogged a small cloud that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I won't be your story," she said without turning. "Not the rescue version. Not the scandal version. If I stay because I choose it. If I leave, it won't be because the internet told me who I am." Declan stood beside her, leaving a careful inch of space. The city had shifted color, as if someone had dragged a dimmer switch across the skyline. "What do you choose?" he asked. "Silence for the rest of the day," she said. "Reading, and the right to answer questions only when they matter." He nodded. "Done." They stood there for a long moment, two outlines on a sheet of glass, the world below roaring and tiny. Then Ella lifted her newspapers again, the soft rustle a private kind of thunder, and returned to her table. She reopened a page, underlined a sentence, and in that small, defiant act reclaimed the only thing the weather couldn't touch, the discipline of attention. By evening, another photo drifted online, not sharp, not staged. A woman at a corner table with a stack of papers and a chipped cup, head bowed, pencil moving. A man a few paces away, not touching, not hovering, simply there. The caption was clumsy. The images were kinder than the words. Somewhere in the scroll, between the jeers and the pity and the think pieces, someone wrote, "Maybe the story isn't what we think. Maybe the headlines are wrong." Ella didn't see it. She never scrolled. Instead, she drew a square around a paragraph that read, in small print near the bottom of a page, about a library extending its hours because the evenings had grown cold. She smiled, just a little, and folded the paper so that the paragraph sat on top, a quiet warmth she could carry. The city felt heavier the next morning, as if every billboard and bus stop poster carried the weight of speculation. Declan's name trended alongside Ella's face, pixelated and stretched across timelines with captions that twisted kindness into scandal. Some praised him for humanity. Others accused him of manipulation. The truth, as always, was invisible in the noise. Ella noticed it before Declan did. She had walked past a cafe window on her way back to the office, and there, on the television bolted to the wall, her own ink-smudged cheek appeared beneath the headline. Mystery Woman INCO's Life, Love Story or Publicity Stunt. The sound was muted, but the scrolling bar of speculation was loud enough. She stepped inside, ordered nothing, and watched herself dissected by strangers. One commentator smiled too sweetly as she described Ella's aesthetic of poverty, like it was a fashion trend. Ella's throat tightened, but she kept her back straight as she left the cafe. She had been invisible for so long. Now visibility felt like an attack. By the time she reached the 31st floor, her hands trembled not from cold but from fury. Declan looked up from his desk the moment she entered. His eyes searched her face, reading what the internet had already written there. He pushed aside his tablet, where headlines bled across the screen, and rose. "I told you," Ella said, dropping the newspaper bundle onto his desk. The pages fanned out like broken wings. "They'll hate me by morning." "And they do." He shook his head, stepping closer. "They don't know you. They don't care to know me," she replied sharply. "They just want a story, and you gave them one." The words stung him more than she intended. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Instead, he walked to the window, staring out at the city where his name lived on billboards and news feeds, but never in peace. "Maybe I was selfish," he admitted. "Maybe I just wanted someone to remind me what the truth sounds like." Ella studied him. The man who commanded rooms, who had built an empire from code and risk, suddenly looked smaller against the skyline. Vulnerable. It was disarming. A knock interrupted them. The door opened before Declan could answer. His head of communications stepped in, her tone brisk. "The board wants you downstairs. Press is circling. We can't stall much longer." Declan nodded. "Schedule a statement for noon." Ella frowned. "A statement? About me? About us?" Declan corrected, meeting her eyes. "Or rather, about what you said yesterday in that room." Confusion flickered across her face. "What I said." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "About loyalty being a myth, about routines being survival. About mirrors. You spoke truths my company forgot to hear. I want the world to hear them too." Ella's pulse quickened. "You want me to stand beside you? Like some mascot?" "No," Declan said firmly. "Like a partner." The word unsettled her. Partner. It implied equality but also risk. She crossed her arms. "And if I say no? Then I'll face them alone," he replied. "But I'll still quote you, because your words matter more than their headlines." Silence stretched between them, taut as wire. Ella turned away, pacing toward the stack of newspapers she'd dropped earlier. She picked one up, flipping through until she found a story buried in the back pages about a community center closing due to lack of funds. She tapped it. "This," she said, "this is what matters. Not what I wore, not how you opened a door for me. If you want a statement, make it about something bigger than us." Declan's gaze softened. "Then come with me and say it yourself." Her breath caught. The idea terrified her. Yet beneath the fear was something else. The memory of sitting outside the library, her words echoing only in her own head. Now someone offered her a microphone. "Fine," she whispered almost to herself. "But if I speak, it won't be for you. It'll be for anyone who's ever been treated like background noise." A faint smile curved his mouth. "That's exactly why it has to be you." The elevator ride to the press hall felt like descending into another world. Cameras flashed the moment the doors opened, voices clashing like waves. Ella's heart pounded. Declan reached back. Not touching, not pulling, just holding his hand loosely near hers like an anchor she could take or leave. She didn't take it, but she didn't walk away either. The stage lights were merciless. Declan stepped up first, his voice even practiced, the kind that had guided shareholders through storms. "You want to know who she is?" he said, motioning toward Ella. "But the better question is what she showed me. That innovation means nothing if it doesn't survive real life. That loyalty is fragile, but habits are strong. That sometimes the clearest truth comes from the person no one thinks belongs in the room." Then he stepped aside. And for the first time, Ella Vames stood in front of a wall of cameras, newspapers clutched to her chest like armor, and let the world see her not as a headline, but as a voice. The cameras blinked like restless eyes, impatient for a confession, hungry for scandal. Ella stood still at the podium, her coat collar frayed, her hands trembling around the stack of newspapers she carried as if they were holy scriptures. The reporters' voices rose in overlapping demands. Who is she? Why is she here? Is this a publicity stunt? But she didn't answer at once. She flipped open the top paper, smoothing its wrinkled page with care, and silence began to coil through the room like an unexpected hush in a storm. "My name is Ella Vames," she said finally. Her voice was clear, though soft, each word deliberate. "I am not a publicity stunt. I am not a charity project. I am someone who reads old newspapers because I cannot afford new ones. And because in those words, yesterday's headlines, I find truths that still matter today." Some laughter rippled at the edges of the crowd, quick and cynical, but she ignored it. She turned the paper outward, showing the back page article she had circled in pencil. Neighborhood library to close due to lack of funds. "This," she continued, tapping the page, "wasn't front page news. It should have been. Because when a library closes, you don't just lose a building, you lose futures. You lose voices that haven't been heard yet." Her pencil hovered above the article like a compass pointing north. She took a breath. "I want to propose something, not as a CEO, not as a politician, just as a reader. Imagine a platform called PaperBridge, where reading is currency, where the time you spend learning can be exchanged for essentials. Food vouchers, transit passes, even secondhand books. Where habits, not loyalty, create change. Because words don't just inform, they feed." The room stilled. Some reporters blinked in confusion. Others scribbled as if afraid to lose the phrasing. "Right now," Ella went on, voice gaining strength, "we throw away yesterday's news like it has no value. But what if we turned it into tomorrow's bridge? A system where the act of reading, of proving you engaged with an article, a story, a piece of knowledge, earns you points. Points that mean dinner, or bus fare, or a textbook. It wouldn't solve everything, but it would prove that knowledge and survival are not enemies. They're partners." One reporter called out, skeptical, "And who pays for this bridge? Charity? Taxes?" Ella's eyes flicked to Declan, standing a few feet behind her, his gaze steady. Then she looked back at the sea of microphones. "No," she said firmly. "Partnerships. Companies already pay billions for advertising that buys seconds of attention. Why not invest those same dollars in rewarding deeper attention? If a headline matters enough to publish, it should matter enough to feed someone who reads it." A low murmur swept the hall. For the first time, the cameras stopped blinking like predators and began to record like witnesses. Declan stepped forward then, not to interrupt but to anchor. "You asked if she belongs here," he said, his voice strong but unpolished, the edge of honesty sharpening it. "She belongs more than most of us." She saw a flaw in how we think about people, not as markets, not as clicks, but as human beings who live and learn at the same time. And she's right. We've forgotten that. I have forgotten that. The statement hit harder than any corporate slogan. For a moment, Declan Reed, the billionaire CEO, wasn't framed as savior or schemer. He was framed as a man admitting failure, willing to rebuild. Reporters bombarded them again, but the tone had shifted. Questions weren't about scandal now, they were about viability. How would PaperBridge track reading? How would points be distributed? What partners would agree? Ella leaned into the microphone one last time. "Start small. Start with one bridge. A library, cafe, a bus route. Let people earn dignity with their attention, not just their wallets. If we can turn recycled paper into heat for a room, we can turn recycled words into hope for a person." She stepped back, chest rising and falling, clutching her stack of newspapers tight. Declan reached out, not to pull her, not to guide her, but simply to steady the top sheet that threatened to slide from her arms. Their hands brushed for half a second, and the click of cameras froze that moment into permanence. By the time they left the podium, the world outside had already begun to rewrite its headline. Not mystery woman, not CEO's publicity stunt, but something stranger, rarer. Poor woman proposes idea that could change everything. In the back seat of the car, Ella pressed her forehead to the glass, watching the city rush past. They'll twist it again tomorrow, she murmured. Maybe, Declan said, but today you bent the frame, and sometimes one bend is all it takes for the whole thing to snap open. Ella closed her eyes, hearing the word she had spoken, PaperBridge, echoing in her own head. For the first time, she wasn't sure if it was just an idea or the beginning of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. The rain arrived without ceremony, slipping over the city in a thin, persistent veil that made everything look a little farther away. Ella woke before dawn in the quiet corner of the shelter where she sometimes slept, folded her newspapers into a tight roll, and sat on the edge of the narrow cot listening to water tap the window. Her name was somewhere on 1,000 screens by now, attached to an idea she wasn't sure she owned yet. That alone made it hard to breathe. By 7, she was walking. She didn't text Declan. She didn't text anyone. The streets were gentler in the rain. People hurried with their heads down, which meant fewer eyes snagging on her face with that flash of recognition she had come to dread. She stopped at a bodega that left yesterday's papers in a plastic crate by the door for recycling. The owner nodded without comment as she lifted 2 copies and tucked them beneath her coat to keep them dry. The library on 9th opened its doors early for seniors and anyone with a reason to be indoors. Ella smiled at the guard, who pretended not to know her and held the door 2 beats longer than usual. She made straight for the bulletin board by the computers, where a handwritten sign advertised, "Resume help, volunteer needed." She tore the tag with the phone number, folded it into the paper, and took a seat at a terminal that hummed like a tired refrigerator. A woman with a nervous laugh sat beside her, clutching a folder of mismatched documents. "They told me you help," the woman said. "I don't know who they is, but I need it." Ella turned, softened. "What's your name?" "Martina." "Okay, Martina. Let's make your future look like it's always been waiting for you." She said it lightly but meant every word. For the next hour, she rebuilt a resume out of scattered dates and uncredited skills. Food safety certification, cash handling, a year of babysitting that translated into customer care, crisis management, scheduling. Language borrowed the shape of possibility. As they worked, Ella felt something settle inside her, the familiar stillness of usefulness that nothing else could imitate. When Martina left with a printed sheet and a straighter spine, Ella packed her papers and moved on. There was a community center 11 blocks south with a bulletin board that always needed fresh eyes, a cafe that sometimes swapped coffee for help translating forms, a bus stop where 2 teenagers argued every morning about whether their city would ever notice them. Ella belonged to all these places, not because they wanted her, but because she had learned how to leave each one a fraction better than she'd found it. Her phone buzzed once. She ignored it. It buzzed again. She pulled it out reluctantly, a number she didn't recognize. She let it ring out and slip into silence. When it lit again, she answered without hello. "Where are you?" Declan asked, voice low, careful. "Walking," she said. "Are you safe? Safer than your inbox?" A breath that might have been a laugh or a sigh. "You disappeared." "I stepped off the stage," she corrected. "Big difference. Stages are built to collapse if you stay too long." He didn't argue. "Can I meet you?" "You can try," she said. and gave him the address of the community center as if she were issuing a small test. He arrived out of breath and out of place, hair damp from rain, coat darkened at the shoulders. The volunteers at the front desk pretended not to stare. Ella stood by a corkboard pinning a flyer about an ESL class so the corners wouldn't curl. She didn't turn when he stepped up beside her, but she felt the temperature of the room change, as if the air recognized him even if the people decided not to. "PaperBridge is in my inbox," he said softly. "Investors with polite curiosity. Journalists with sharpened knives. A city councilwoman who wants to talk about pilots. I should be thrilled. Instead, I'm here." Ella pressed the thumbtack flat. "You're here because you're not sure if you invited me into your world to use my voice or to hear it. I'm here because I need to be certain I'm not letting your world replace mine." He nodded once, as if accepting a verdict. "Then show me yours." She did. She took him to the kids' corner where a teenager named Jayla read to two smaller boys in a voice that made punctuation sound like permission. She introduced him to the center's director, a woman with a clipboard and a righteous frown whose first words to Declan were, "If you're here to donate glossy furniture, keep walking. We need hot spots and night hours." Declan smiled, chastened, and asked questions instead of offering solutions. They walked to the bodega where the owner, Dennis, swept rain out the door in practiced arcs. "She's the only person who uses the leave a book, take a bookshelf like a religion," he said, jerking his chin at Ella. "Half my customers think old paper only wraps fish. She makes it a sermon." In the cafe, Ella translated a government form for a man who had been fined for a subway turnstile error he didn't understand. She explained the appeal process slowly, pausing to make sure he could repeat the steps back to her. Declan watched, silent, understanding with a small shock that his power had never felt as clean as the authority of being useful in real time. At the bus stop, Jayla was there again, arguing with her friend Marco about whether to finish school or start working full-time. Ella slid into the debate like a mediator and a scout. She asked questions they hadn't considered. She suggested walking both paths for a month, night classes plus morning shifts, until data, not fear, answered. She promised to help with applications, to bring articles on scholarships, to sit with them and read the parts that turned bureaucratic on purpose. By afternoon, the rain had become a fine, stubborn mist that settled on hair and lashes. They ducked into a laundromat that accepted library cards as ID for free dryer cycles on Thursdays. Ella leaned against a humming machine, arms folded, eyes on Declan. "This is my world," she said. "It doesn't trend. It doesn't applaud. It doesn't write think pieces unless a governor needs a photo op. But it's where PaperBridge was born, because it's where attention is a survival skill." Declan met her gaze. "Then I don't want to build it above your world. I want to build it with it. With you." She looked away, jaw working. "That word again." "Which?" he asked, though he knew. "Partner," she said quietly. "People like to borrow it when they mean accessory." "I don't," he said. The force of it surprised them both. "I don't want a mascot. I don't want to rent your story and return it when the metric's cool. I want to sign what I say out loud. PaperBridge doesn't exist without you. If it ever does, it'll be because you wrote its grammar." The laundromat's door chimed. A little boy ran in chasing a red balloon, laughter bouncing off tile and chrome. Ella watched the balloon bob, the string tugging at small fingers, the way he adjusted grip instinctively as if flying were a chore you learned on the job. Her voice, when it came, was softer. "I left this morning because I needed to know who I am when no one is watching," she said. "When the camera is off and the room is full of ordinary need. I needed to be certain that PaperBridge was still true in rooms where the floor is sticky and the clock is broken." "And?" Declan asked. "It was," she said. But that doesn't mean I trust the rooms you live in. She turned back to him, eyes steady. If I walk into them, the terms have to protect the idea from the glee of people who love to name things and then take them. What terms? He asked, not flinching. Real ones, she said. Ownership, not optics. 50-50 on the pilot. My veto on anything that turns it into a loyalty trap instead of a habit builder. Transparent reporting that a person on a library computer can read without a dictionary. Partners from the neighborhood's first, money last. And every press event includes one person who actually used the program speaking before either of us. Declan felt something unspool in his chest. Relief, respect, the recognition of a line he wanted to stand behind even if it cost him applause. Yes, he said. All of it. Don't say yes because you're in a laundromat and it sounds noble, she warned. Say yes because you'll still mean it in a glass room with the word synergy on a slide. He smiled despite himself. I hate that word. Good, she said. You can keep hating it in writing. They walked back out into the damp afternoon. The city had not grown kinder, but it had grown quieter. Ella stopped at the mouth of an alley where an old newspaper box leaned at a crooked angle, its window fogged from the inside. She opened it, took out 2 limp copies, and held one toward Declan. Here, she said. Payment for services not yet rendered. He took it, looked at the date. Yesterday. The cover story was about a sports scandal. Buried on page B7 was a column about a commuter rail expansion petition. Ella had circled 3 paragraphs and drawn lines connecting them to notes in the margin. Noise, funding, jobs. It was a map disguised as an afterthought. What are we? He asked quietly, more to the rain than to her. Hungry, she said, a wry edge at the corner of her mouth. For work, not spectacle. She stepped back, the distance between them deliberate, kind. Go draft the terms. Don't send them to your lawyers first. Send them to me. If they survive this side of town, they might survive yours. He nodded, throat tight. And you? I'm going to the night class at the church basement on 12th to help with digital literacy, she said. If PaperBridge is going to ask people to read, it should meet them where the words don't pretend to be polite. He stood there until she turned the corner and vanished into the soft weather. For once he didn't follow. He folded the damp newspaper and slipped it inside his coat like a note passed in a school he wished he'd attended. Back in the car, he dictated into his phone, voice steady, naming each term she had spoken as if they were oaths. He deleted the phrase corporate initiative, where it crept in, and replaced it with community contract. He crossed out user acquisition and typed habit earned. He wrote at the top of the page in plain letters, if Ella says no, this doesn't exist. That night, in the church basement, Ella sat beside 3 women who had never touched a spreadsheet and a man who thought the internet was a river you had to cross barefoot. She watched their faces light when their cursors finally obeyed. She taught them to open a tab, to search a word, to close a pop-up without panic. She scribbled a list for next week. Scams look like help. Settings are not secrets. You're allowed to ask. When the class ended, the pastor offered her a styrofoam cup of soup. She held it in both hands and thought about a glass room where she would soon insist on terms that sounded like blasphemy to people who burned slides as incense. She smiled, a small, private thing, and whispered to no one, to everyone, bridge first, headlines later. Across town, Declan printed the draft, held a pen, and for once in his life made a signature wait. He wrote a line at the bottom that he had never written before in any contract. This only works if the quiet rooms agree. Then he sat back, wondering how a person could feel both terrified and more honest than they had in years. He put the pages in an envelope and addressed it not to her shelter or a sleek office but to the community center on 11th, care of the front desk. He imagined the righteous frown softening when she read the terms. He imagined a corkboard with a new flyer. PaperBridge pilot sign up here. Bring your attention. We'll bring the rest. In a city that fed on noise, two people chose, separately, the discipline of attention. Felt like treason. Felt like relief. And in the fragile, wet quiet of that night, something steadier than a headline began to exist. By the time the contract reached the community center, the city had already moved on to another scandal. A celebrity divorce, a stock market hiccup, a mayoral slip of the tongue. Headlines shuffled like cards in a restless hand. But Ella knew better than anyone that yesterday's news never truly vanished. It only waited to be reread. She sat on the center steps, envelope in her lap, thumb running along its sealed edge. The paper inside was thick, corporate, expensive. She half expected it to feel like a trick. But when she opened it and read, her breath caught. There it was, line after line, in Declan's precise handwriting and black ink. 50-50 partnership. Veto power on design. Transparency written in plain language. Local partners before investors. Every press event led by a program participant. And at the bottom, beneath his signature, words that didn't sound like a CEO at all. This only works if the quiet rooms agree. Ella closed her eyes. For the first time since the photo outside the revolving door, she felt the ground steady beneath her. That evening, she returned to the 31st floor, not as a guest and not as a charity project, but carrying the signed copy like a ticket she had bought herself. Declan was waiting by the window, tie loosened, posture uncertain. When she laid the paper on his desk, she didn't sit. She folded her arms. "I accept," she said simply. "But if you ever try to make me your symbol instead of your equal, I'll walk out and take the bridge with me." Declan's mouth curved, not in amusement but in something closer to reverence. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you don't want to." For weeks after, the pilot program bloomed in unexpected corners. The first PaperBridge station stood outside the very library Ella used to haunt. A battered kiosk refurbished into a scanner where people could answer questions about articles and earn credits they could trade at local shops. Skeptics called it a gimmick. Cynics predicted it would collapse within a month. But then someone used their points to buy fresh fruit, another covered a bus ride to a job interview, and a third exchanged them for a used math textbook. Slowly, disbelief bent into attention. Ella insisted on attending every feedback session. She listened to single mothers juggling schedules, to teenagers testing the edges of hope, to retirees who finally felt their hours of reading were worth something. She took notes in margins, circled ideas, underlined problems. Declan sat beside her, silent more often than not, watching her translate complaints into blueprints. The press circled again, this time curious. Headlines shifted from mystery woman to PaperBridge, a radical literacy pilot. Ella stood at microphones, not smiling, not softening, but speaking truths in the same voice she once used under a flickering street lamp. Declan rarely interrupted. He let her words anchor the story. But the most important moment came quietly. One afternoon at the library kiosk, a little boy placed his palm on the glass scanner with solemn care. He had just finished a short article about city parks. When the machine beeped and printed a voucher for a sandwich, his eyes widened as if the world had just proven it could be kind. He ran to show his mother. Ella watched from a few steps away, hand over her mouth, tears she hadn't expected pricking her lashes. Declan stepped up beside her. "That's your work," he said softly. "No," Ella whispered. "That's his. That's what happens when someone believes their attention counts." Declan didn't argue. Instead, he slipped a folded page from his coat pocket. It was a clipping of the very first article she had circled for him in the office, the one about loyalty and habits. He had written in the margin, "This is where you changed me." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time allowed herself to imagine what it meant that this man, whose name once lived only on skyscrapers, now stood beside her like a partner in something more fragile, more enduring. Weeks later, at a community celebration in the library's basement, children sat cross-legged on the floor surrounded by towers of donated newspapers. Someone had tied colorful ribbons to the stacks. A hand-painted sign read, "Yesterday's news, tomorrow's bridge." Declan raised a toast, but the cheers that followed weren't for him. They were for Ella, who blushed and shook her head but didn't retreat. When the noise softened, he leaned close and said, low enough only she could hear, "Ella, there's one clause missing from our contract." She arched a brow. "Which?" "The part where I admit I don't just want you as a partner in PaperBridge," he murmured. "I want you as a partner in everything." Her laugh was small, shaky, and disbelieving, but her hand found his under the table, ink-stained fingers threading through his steady ones. For the first time in years, Declan Reed didn't feel like a man defending an empire. He felt like a man building a life, one headline at a time, with the woman who once chose knowledge over food and in doing so, fed them both. The night of the launch felt like standing at the edge of a river that had once been invisible. What began as a kiosk outside a single library had swollen into something undeniable: cafes, bus stations, schools, even laundromats now hosting small PaperBridge terminals. What started as skepticism had become proof. People were reading, earning, feeding themselves not just with words but with the dignity of choosing how those words mattered. The city gathered to celebrate in the old Plaza Auditorium, a space usually reserved for stockholder briefings and polished galas. Tonight, the room was different. Children held newspapers folded into paper boats. Teenagers compared vouchers like trading cards. Parents clutched grocery bags stamped with PaperBridge Partner. The hum wasn't the sharp chatter of investors. It was the steady rhythm of a community arriving. Ella stood backstage, clutching her stack of notes though she barely glanced at them. Her coat was still the same one she had worn that first night beneath the library lamp, but now it looked like a badge, not a burden. Declan found her in the shadows. He looked uncharacteristically nervous, his tie uneven, his jaw tight. "You don't have to do this," she said, sensing his tension. "I do," he replied quietly, "because this isn't about the program anymore. It's about the truth I've been carrying." Before she could ask, the announcer's voice filled the hall, introducing the co-founders of PaperBridge. A roar of applause met them as they stepped into the light. Ella shielded her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed, but then her focus steadied as she saw the faces. Ordinary, imperfect, real. These were her people, her audience, her quiet rooms. She spoke first. Not about herself, not about Declan, but about the boy who had exchanged his first voucher for a sandwich, the mother who used hers for bus fare to work, the elderly man who had read every article just to buy a new pair of glasses. She told the crowd, "We are proving that attention is not a waste. It is currency, and it is priceless." The applause swelled again. Then Declan stepped forward, adjusting the microphone with a steadiness that belied the storm in his chest. He looked not at the crowd but at Ella. "When this began," he said, voice resonant, "everyone asked me who she was. They called her a mystery, a charity, a scandal. They called her everything except what she really is, the reason I remembered what matters. She read discarded newspapers instead of buying food, and in doing so she taught me that the mind starves long before the body does. She gave me an idea, yes, but more than that, she gave me a mirror. And I didn't just see a company I could fix. I saw a life I wanted to share. The audience hushed. Declan's words carried further than the microphone. They vibrated with something raw, unvarnished. "I am not announcing a merger or a milestone tonight," he continued. "I am confessing. I love her. Ella, I love you. Not as a partner in business, but as the partner I didn't know I was waiting for." Gasps rippled through the hall. Cameras clicked. But for Ella, the sound dimmed. Her throat tightened, her eyes stung, and for once she didn't reach for words. She stepped toward him instead, her hand finding his, newspapers still clutched in her other arm. She leaned into the microphone. "For the record," she said, her smile trembling but real. "Partnership was always 50-50, in PaperBridge. And in this," the auditorium erupted. Cheers, applause, the stomp of feet. Children waved their paper boats in the air like sails catching wind. In that thunder of approval, the headlines rewrote themselves, not by journalists but by the people who had lived the story. Not mystery woman, not publicity stunt, but a bridge built on words and love. Weeks later, photographs traveled farther than either of them imagined. Ella and Declan at the United Nations, presenting PaperBridge as a model for literacy and dignity. A snapshot of Ella signing her name beside his on a global pledge. A candid image of them at a Paris bookstall by the Seine, her ink-stained fingers pointing to an old edition of Camus, his hand resting gently over hers. One evening, as twilight painted the city blue, Declan set down a small box on a table stacked with newspapers. No diamonds, no glitter. Inside lay a ring fashioned from silver etched with lines of text so fine they looked like whispers frozen in metal. Ella's laugh was soft, incredulous. "Is that a headline?" "No," he said. "It's yesterday's news turned into forever." And beneath the glow of a street lamp not so different from the one where it all began, Ella Vames, once invisible, once dismissed as background noise, answered not with a headline, but with a word. "Yes."